I spent 40 years building an empire with the sweat of my brow, only to realize the monsters I needed to protect it from were sitting right across my dinner table. I should have seen the rot festering in them years ago, long before the ink dried on those estate documents. But a father's love is the thickest blindfold in the world. My name is Arthur. I am 68 years old, and for more than half my life, I poured every ounce of my soul into a custom machining and manufacturing company. It was not glamorous work by any stretch of the imagination. It meant early mornings that began long before the sun came up, late nights smelling of motor oil and hot metal, and decades of relentless stress that turned my hair gray prematurely. But I did it all for my family. More specifically, I did it for my late wife, Eleanor, and the 3 children we brought into this world together: Richard, Sarah, and Jason. Eleanor was the true heart of our family. She was the steady hand that kept me grounded when the business was struggling in its early days. And she was the gentle, reassuring voice that reminded me why I was working so hard when I wanted to quit. When she passed away from cancer 5 years ago, a massive, irreplaceable part of me died right alongside her. The large house we built together suddenly felt like a tomb. The business, which used to bring me a profound sense of pride, suddenly felt like a heavy iron anchor dragging me down into the dirt. I realized that without my wife to share the fruits of our labor, the daily grind was entirely meaningless. So, at the age of 65, I made the difficult decision to step away and sell the company. It was a highly lucrative acquisition. After settling all corporate debts, liquidating assets, and paying a small fortune in taxes, I walked away with $8 million. I took $3 million to ensure I could live out my remaining years in absolute peace, maintaining the family home and covering my living and medical expenses without a single worry. But the bulk of the money, exactly $5 million, I placed into a formal, revocable trust. The terms were straightforward and, I thought, incredibly generous. The trust was legally designed to remain untouched while I was alive, serving as a final safety net if I ever needed extensive, round-the-clock medical care in my twilight years. Upon my passing, the entire $5 million would be divided equally among Richard, Sarah, and Jason. It was meant to be my final, lasting gift to them, a rock-solid foundation to ensure their children, and their children's children, would never know the bitter financial struggles Eleanor and I endured in our youth. I honestly thought the promise of a secure, guaranteed future would bring out the best in them. I was dead wrong. Almost immediately after the trust was established and the paperwork was filed, the subtle shifts in their behavior began to surface. It was not an overnight transformation, but rather a slow, creeping sense of unearned entitlement that seeped into every single interaction we had. Richard, my eldest son, was the first to show his true colors. He worked in commercial real estate, a volatile, high-stakes industry that fed his massive ego. Richard always had to project an image of supreme success. He drove luxury cars he leased at terrible rates, wore designer suits, and bought expensive watches. He lived a hollow life entirely financed by credit, banking on mega deals that rarely materialized. Once he knew a third of $5 million was sitting in a trust with his name on it as a future beneficiary. His arrogance multiplied tenfold. He stopped asking me for fatherly advice and started acting like a man who had already inherited a vast fortune. He treated waiters poorly, spoke down to his peers, and carried a smug aura of untouchable wealth that he had done absolutely nothing to earn. Then there was Sarah, my middle child. She had always been highly image-conscious, but after Eleanor died, she became completely obsessed with societal status. She married a man whose ambition was as thin as wet paper, and together they bought a sprawling, high-maintenance mansion they absolutely could not afford on their combined incomes. Sarah began to treat my hard-earned wealth as an extension of her own social capital. She would drop heavy-handed hints at family dinners about how hard it was to maintain their lavish lifestyle, shooting me pointed, expectant looks, as if waiting for me to simply pull out a checkbook and erase her self-inflicted burdens. She viewed the trust not as a loving legacy, but as a delayed, inconvenient payout that was unfairly keeping her from her rightful place among the city's elite. And finally, Jason, my youngest, the golden boy who simply never grew up. Jason styled himself as a tech entrepreneur, which was a polite way of saying he spent his days hopping from one failed startup idea to another, burning through investor cash with absolutely nothing to show for it. Jason rarely asked for money outright, knowing I despised handouts. Instead, he constantly pitched me. He would corner me at holiday gatherings, armed with flashy tablet presentations for apps and digital platforms I barely understood, aggressively asking for seed money. When I politely declined, reminding him that my funds were securely locked in the trust for the future, the artificial warmth would instantly vanish from his eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating resentment that chilled me to the bone. I foolishly brushed off these glaring warning signs. I told myself they were just going through rough patches, that they were stressed by the endless demands of modern life. I refused to see the greedy, grasping hands they were hiding behind their backs, completely unaware of the reckless, shadow deals they were already making based on the money they assumed was practically in their bank accounts. The turning point of my life came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The weather was unusually warm for early autumn, and I was in the backyard, tending to Eleanor's prized rose garden. It was one of the few physical activities that still brought me a sense of genuine, quiet peace. I remember kneeling on the damp soil, heavy pruning shears in my right hand, when a strange, terrible sensation washed over me. It started as a faint, high-pitched ringing in my ears, followed quickly by a crushing tightness in my chest that made it nearly impossible to draw a full breath. I stood up, thinking I had merely risen too fast and caused a head rush, but the solid ground beneath my feet seemed to tilt violently. The vibrant reds and pinks of the roses blurred into a messy, swirling smear. A cold, clammy sweat broke out across my forehead, and my heart began to hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird desperately trying to escape a cage. I tried to walk toward the safety of the back porch, but my legs felt like lead weights. The world spun faster and faster, a dizzying carousel of green grass and bright blue sky, until my knees finally buckled. I hit the ground hard, the pruning shears slipping from my numb fingers. My vision narrowed to a tiny, dark tunnel, and the very last thing I remember was the sharp smell of damp earth before everything went entirely black. When I finally opened my eyes, the familiar, comforting scent of my garden was gone, replaced by the harsh, sterile smell of medical antiseptic. A steady, rhythmic beeping sound echoed softly in my ears. I blinked against the painfully bright fluorescent lights, my vision slowly coming into focus to reveal the pale, beige walls of a hospital room. A thick IV line was taped securely to the back of my hand, and various glowing monitors flanked the bed. I felt incredibly weak and disoriented, but my mind was surprisingly clear. I was alive. A nurse walked into the room shortly after I woke up, offering a warm, professional smile and a small plastic cup of ice water. She gently explained that a neighbor had seen me collapse in the dirt and immediately called an ambulance. It was a severe, sudden drop in blood pressure, exacerbated by mild dehydration and fatigue. Frightening, certainly, but not a massive heart attack, not a death sentence. The attending physician wanted to keep me overnight for observation, just to run a few more comprehensive tests and ensure my heart rhythm remained completely stable. As I lay there against the stiff hospital pillows, sipping the cold water, a wave of profound relief washed over me. I had dodged a massive bullet. My first thought, naturally, went straight to my children. They must be absolutely terrified. The hospital staff assured me they had been contacted and were already on their way up to the ward. I pictured them rushing through the swinging hospital doors, faces pale with worry, united by the sudden, terrifying fear of losing their remaining parent. I expected tears. I expected tight, desperate hugs and quiet words of relief. I expected a fractured family suddenly brought closer together by a harsh brush with mortality. I waited in that quiet, sterile room, my eyes fixed on the heavy wooden door, longing for the comfort of my 2 sons and my daughter. I was vulnerable, lying in a thin cotton hospital gown, desperately needing the warmth of the people I had spent 40 long years providing for. But as the heavy silver handle finally turned and the door swung open, the relief I felt evaporated entirely. Because the people who walked into my room did not bring comfort, and they certainly did not bring love. They brought something else entirely, setting into motion a waking nightmare that would force me to tear down my own legacy brick by brick. The door to my hospital room swung open, not with the frantic rush of terrified children, but with the calculated, heavy thud of a corporate acquisition. The chill that swept into the room had absolutely nothing to do with the air conditioning. I pushed myself up against the stiff pillows, a genuine smile forming on my lips despite the lingering weakness in my limbs. I was ready to reassure them, ready to tell Richard, Sarah, and Jason that their old man was too stubborn to be taken out by a mere patch of warm weather and a skipped glass of water. But the words died in my throat before I could utter a single syllable. Richard walked in first. His stride was slow and measured. His designer suit completely unwrinkled. There was no sweat on his brow, no panic in his eyes. He looked exactly like he did when he was walking into a boardroom to crush a competitor. Sarah followed closely behind him, clutching a leather designer handbag like a shield, her gaze darting around the sterile room as if silently tallying the cost of the medical equipment. Jason brought up the rear, his face illuminated by the harsh blue light of his smartphone. He did not even bother to look up at me when he crossed the threshold. And then, a fourth person stepped into the room. He was a tall, sharply dressed man with slicked back hair and a completely unreadable expression. He carried a thick, dark leather briefcase. He looked entirely out of place in a cardiac observation ward. Yet he carried himself with an authority that immediately made my stomach knot tight. "Richard," I croaked, my voice dry. "Sarah, Jason, who is this?" Richard stopped at the foot of my bed. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not ask what the doctors had said. He simply crossed his arms over his chest and stared down at me with a look of profound, clinical detachment. "Dad, this is Marcus Vance," Richard said, his voice smooth and unnervingly calm. "He is an attorney specializing in aggressive estate management and asset protection." I blinked, the confusion momentarily overriding the dull ache in my chest. "Asset protection? Richard, what on earth are you talking about?" "I fainted in the garden. The doctor said I was dehydrated. I am going home tomorrow morning." Sarah sighed heavily, an exaggerated sound of profound impatience, as if dealing with a stubborn toddler. She stepped forward, her high heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. "Dad, please do not make this harder than it has to be. You collapsed. You were found unconscious in the dirt. We all know what this means. You are 68 years old, and your body is failing. Your mind is next." The sheer cruelty of her words felt like a physical blow. I stared at my only daughter, the little girl I used to carry on my shoulders, searching her face for any trace of warmth or empathy. There was none. Her eyes were hard, focused entirely on a goal I was only just beginning to comprehend. "My mind is perfectly fine," I said, my voice rising slightly, defensive and raw. It was a dizzy spell. The physician assured me it was nothing serious. "Physicians lie to keep you calm," Richard interrupted smoothly, stepping closer to the bed, "or they string you along to keep billing your insurance. The reality, Dad, is that you are entering your twilight years. This little episode today is a glaring red flag. If you require long-term, specialized medical care or a permanent assisted living facility, the costs will be astronomical. The state and the medical system will bleed your accounts dry. They will drain the revocable trust before you even realize what is happening. The trust is exactly for that purpose," I argued, gripping the thin hospital blanket with trembling hands. "It is a safety net. And whatever remains when I pass, which will be the vast majority of the $5 million, goes directly to the three of you. That was the plan. That is the legacy Eleanor and I wanted for you." Jason finally looked up from his glowing screen. He let out a short, humorless laugh. A legacy does us absolutely no good if the hospital administrators take it all to wipe your chin for the next 10 years. Dad, the money in that trust is just sitting there anyway, bleeding value against inflation. It is completely inefficient. Marcus Vance, the attorney, stepped forward and placed his heavy leather briefcase on the rolling tray table next to my bed. He clicked the brass locks open with a sharp, terrifying finality. He withdrew a thick stack of legal documents, the pages crisp and stark white under the fluorescent lights. "Arthur," the lawyer said, his tone dripping with a rehearsed, sickening sympathy. "Your children have brought me here to help you protect your life's work. The smartest, most secure legal maneuver we can execute right now is to immediately dissolve the revocable trust. We can disperse the $5 million equally to Richard, Sarah, and Jason today. By transferring the wealth out of your name entirely, we shield it from any future medical claims or debt collection associated with your declining health." I stared at the paperwork, the dense paragraphs of legal jargon blurring together. The sheer audacity of the ambush left me completely breathless. They had not come to the hospital to comfort a sick father. They had brought a corporate mercenary to raid my accounts while I was strapped to a heart monitor. I looked from Richard to Sarah, and finally to Jason. The silence in the room stretched out, heavy and suffocating. Why were they moving with such aggressive speed? The lawyer clearly had these complex documents drafted long before my collapse in the rose garden. This ambush was not a spontaneous reaction to my health scare. This was a highly premeditated strike. My fainting spell simply provided the convenient, flimsy excuse they had been eagerly waiting for. Furthermore, beneath his polished exterior, there was a frantic, vibrating tension in Richard's jaw that told me he was running from a massive fire I could not yet see. He needed this money, and he needed it yesterday. Sarah's knuckles were white as she gripped her expensive purse, betraying a deep, hidden panic. They were all hiding something massive from me. "You want me to sign away my entire safety net," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "You want me to hand over $5 million, effectively leaving myself completely dependent on the goodwill of 3 people who could not even bring themselves to ask if I was okay when they walked into my hospital room." "Do not be dramatic. Dad," Sarah snapped, her patience completely evaporating. "We will make sure you are taken care of. We will find a nice, affordable facility for you when the time comes. But that money belongs to us. You promised it to us. It is our inheritance, and we are simply securing it before your declining state ruins everything." "Our inheritance." She spoke the words with such fierce, blinding entitlement that it physically repulsed me. They did not see a father lying in this bed. They saw an obstacle. They saw a stubborn, breathing roadblock standing between them and the wealth that I had spent 40 years bleeding for. Eleanor's memory flashed vividly in my mind. She would have been absolutely devastated to see the monsters our children had become. But Eleanor was gone, and I was the only one left to deal with the harsh, ugly reality of their greed. "I am not signing anything," I said firmly, pushing the rolling tray table away from my bed. The metal legs screeched loudly against the floor. Richard's face darkened, the polite corporate mask slipping away to reveal the cold, ruthless bully underneath. "Dad, do not be an idiot. You are making a massive mistake. The only mistake I made was believing any of you possessed a single shred of human decency," I fired back, the adrenaline finally cutting through the lingering fatigue of my collapse. "Take your lawyer, take your paperwork, and get the hell out of my room." Marcus Vance calmly gathered the documents, slipping them back into his briefcase. He looked at Richard, silently deferring to the man who was actually paying his exorbitant hourly rate. Richard leaned over my bed, planting his hands firmly on the mattress, bringing his face uncomfortably close to mine. His eyes were wide and manic. "Listen to me very carefully, old man. You are not in control here anymore. You cannot even stand up in your own backyard without passing out. If you refuse to do this the easy way, if you refuse to protect our money, we will do it the hard way. We will petition the court. We will have you declared medically incompetent, and we will assume total guardianship over your estate. We will take the reins away from you by force." He held my gaze for a long, terrible moment, letting the threat hang heavy in the sterile hospital air. Then, he stood up straight, adjusted his perfect tie, and turned on his heel. "Let's go," Richard commanded. Sarah and Jason followed him out without a single backward glance, the attorney trailing behind them like an obedient shadow. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, plunging the room back into a deafening silence, broken only by the steady, mocking beep of my heart monitor. I lay back against the pillows, entirely alone. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, that I could not even find the strength to cry. They were going to war with me. My own flesh and blood were prepared to drag my name through the mud, to strip away my dignity and declare me a feeble-minded invalid, all to get their hands on a bank account. They thought I was weak. They thought I was just a tired old man who would eventually fold under their aggressive legal threats. They completely forgot the man who built a manufacturing empire from scratch, the man who spent 40 years crushing ruthless competitors and surviving vicious corporate battles. As I stared up at the blank, white ceiling of the hospital room, the crushing weight of my heartbreak began to crystallize into something entirely different. It hardened into a cold, unbreakable resolve. If my children wanted to play a ruthless game of financial warfare, I was more than willing to oblige them. But they were about to learn a devastating lesson. I was the one who wrote the rules, and I was going to burn their unearned kingdom to the ground. The silence of an empty house is a heavy, suffocating blanket, but it provided the exact, brutal clarity I needed to begin dismantling my children's web of lies. I was discharged from the hospital exactly 24 hours after my collapse. The attending cardiologist handed me a pristine bill of health, confirming my episode was nothing more than a cocktail of mild dehydration, skipped meals, and the relentless heat of the afternoon sun. My heart was as strong as a draft horse. He told me with a reassuring pat on the shoulder. If only he knew the profound, sickening ache radiating from the center of my chest had absolutely nothing to do with my arteries. I took a taxi back to my sprawling, quiet property. Not a single phone call came in, not a single text message asking if I had made it home safely. Richard, Sarah, and Jason had drawn their battle lines in that sterile hospital room, and they were firmly entrenched, waiting for me to surrender. But their aggressive, synchronized ambush had triggered a relentless alarm bell in the back of my mind. Successful, financially secure adults do not corner their elderly father with a corporate attack dog over a simple fainting spell. They were frantic. They were operating on a terrifying, invisible ticking clock, and I needed to know exactly what time it was. During my 4 decades in the ruthless world of commercial manufacturing, I learned that information is the ultimate weapon. I picked up the telephone and called a man named David Miller. Miller was a former forensic accountant turned private investigator, a ghost who specialized in untangling the most complex corporate frauds and hidden assets in the state. I paid his exorbitant retainer without a second thought, giving him 3 names, 3 social security numbers, and a single, crystal-clear directive. Pull up every floorboard of my children's lives and show me the rot underneath. The next 72 hours were an agonizing exercise in patience. I tended to Eleanor's roses, drank my coffee on the porch, and played the part of the frail, recovering old man, all while a cold, calculated fury began to replace the sorrow in my blood. I knew my children were hiding a desperate reality, and I knew that once I possessed their secrets, I would finally hold the match to their paper kingdom. The beauty of irrevocable trust, a detail their aggressive lawyers seemingly glossed over in his desperate rush to secure a payout, is that the Creator retains absolute, unchallenged power, a power I was preparing to exercise with extreme prejudice. On the morning of the 4th day, Miller arrived at my front door. He did not smile. He simply carried a thick, heavy accordion folder stuffed to the brim with bank statements, property deeds, and confidential financial audits. We sat at the very dining room table where I had fed, clothed, and celebrated those 3 ungrateful children for decades. Miller opened the folder, and the devastating truth spilled out onto the polished mahogany wood. The illusion of their success vanished in an instant. Richard, my arrogant, luxury-obsessed eldest son, was completely underwater. His commercial real estate firm was not just struggling. It was effectively a walking corpse. He had aggressively over-leveraged himself on 3 massive office complexes just before the commercial market severely contracted. He was millions of dollars in the red, floating his leased sports cars and bespoke suits on high-interest business credit cards that were entirely maxed out. He was exactly 1 missed payment away from total, catastrophic bankruptcy. Sarah's situation was equally pathetic. The massive, beautiful mansion she paraded around like a royal palace was practically a mirage. Miller produced a thick stack of aggressively worded letters from her mortgage lender. Sarah and her useless husband had missed 6 consecutive mortgage payments. They were swimming in consumer debt, financing their lavish country club lifestyle with personal loans they had 0 capacity to repay. The bank had already initiated the early stages of foreclosure. The absolute humiliation of losing her social standing was breathing down her neck, driving her to unimaginable desperation. Then we came to Jason, my golden boy, the visionary tech entrepreneur. Miller's voice dropped an octave as he slid Jason's file across the table. Jason had not just failed at business, he had actively courted extreme danger. Traditional banks had stopped lending him money years ago. To fund his latest doomed venture, Jason had turned to the unregulated, shadowy corners of the private lending market. He borrowed a staggering amount of cash from hard money lenders. These were ruthless, unforgiving men who did not file lawsuits when you missed a payment, but rather sent people to your front door to shatter your kneecaps. Jason's fake company was generating 0 revenue, and the exorbitant, predatory interest rates on his shady loans were compounding daily. He was a trapped rat, cornered by dangerous individuals who wanted their money back immediately. But the final revelation, the piece of paper that truly shattered whatever fragile remaining illusion I held of my family, was buried at the very bottom of Miller's folder. It was a discovery so incredibly vile, so deeply parasitic, that it made my stomach physically churn. Richard, Sarah, and Jason had not just ruined their own lives through sheer, unadulterated greed. They had actively mortgaged my death. Miller uncovered a series of legally binding, high-interest shadow loans that all 3 of my children had taken out independently over the past 18 months. To secure these massive cash injections, they needed collateral, and the collateral they proudly offered was the $5 million revocable trust. They had signed legally binding promissory notes, leveraging their status as future beneficiaries. They had taken out massive loans against their own inheritance, literally betting cash on the assumption that I would die soon enough for them to pay off their lenders. The sheer, sickening reality of their scheme washed over me in a freezing wave. This was why they brought a ruthless estate lawyer to my hospital bed. They did not care about my medical expenses. They did not care if I ended up in a state-run, substandard nursing facility. The shadow lenders were calling in their markers. The walls were closing in on Richard's bankrupt firm, Sarah's foreclosed mansion, and Jason's dangerous creditors. They needed the $5 million dispersed instantly because if they did not get that cash, their false lives would completely implode. If I had weakly signed those documents in the hospital room, the trust would have instantly evaporated. It would have vanished into the pockets of creditors and loan sharks, leaving me entirely penniless in my final years, completely dependent on 3 people who viewed my existence as a financial inconvenience. Giving them the money early would not save them. It would merely reward their profound deceit and validate their monstrous entitlement. I stared at the mountain of damning paperwork spread across my dining room table. The sadness was completely gone now. The heartbreak had been entirely burned away, replaced by a crystalline, diamond-hard resolve. My children had looked at a lifetime of my sweat, my sacrifice, and my unconditional love, and they had calculated its exact dollar value in a predatory loan office. They thought they had engineered the perfect trap, locking me into a corner where I had no choice but to surrender my legacy to save them from their own profound stupidity. They were preparing to march back into my life and demand my complete surrender, but they made one fatal miscalculation. They forgot that the man who built the fortune they were trying to steal was still breathing, still thinking, and still held the absolute legal power to turn their predatory greed into an inescapable prison. The storm I knew was coming finally broke on a quiet Sunday afternoon, arriving not with thunder, but with the arrogant crunch of expensive tires on my gravel driveway. They marched up my front steps with the supreme confidence of conquerors, completely unaware that the very foundation of their financial future was already rigged to explode. I was sitting in my leather armchair in the study, a half-finished cup of black coffee cooling on the side table, when the heavy oak front door swung open without a single knock. They did not even have the basic courtesy to ring the bell. Richard, Sarah, and Jason filed into my home like a demolition crew arriving at a condemned building. The tense, vibrating energy they brought into the hallway instantly poisoned the peaceful atmosphere I had cultivated since my discharge from the hospital. "We need to talk, Dad," Richard announced, his voice echoing loudly off the foyer walls. It was not a request. It was a command issued by a man who desperately believed he held all the cards. I remained in my chair, forcing my breathing to stay slow and steady. I watched them cross the threshold of my study. Sarah was practically vibrating with nervous energy, her eyes darting around the room as if sizing up the antique furniture for a quick estate sale. Jason hung back slightly, his arms crossed tight against his chest, projecting a false sense of boredom that poorly masked his raw desperation. "I was not expecting company," I said mildly, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "Especially not a home invasion on a Sunday." "Drop the self-righteous act," Sarah snapped, her designer heels sinking into the Persian rug. "We are not here to play games. We are here to finalize what we started at the hospital before you threw your little tantrum." Richard stepped forward, aggressively dropping a thick, bound legal folder right onto my antique desk. The loud smack of the heavy paper against the wood made me flinch internally, but I kept my face utterly blank. It was the same paperwork the slick attorney had tried to force on me while I was strapped to a heart monitor. The document that would dissolve the revocable trust and instantly hand them $5 million. "This is the end of the line, Dad," Richard said, leaning his knuckles on my desk and looming over me. "You have two choices today. The easy way or the incredibly ugly way?" "Enlighten me," I replied, lacing my fingers together and resting them on my lap. "You sign this document right now," Richard dictated, his eyes cold and hard. "You dissolve the trust, distribute the funds equally to the three of us by the end of the business day tomorrow, and we walk away. You get to keep living in this massive house alone, and we get the capital we need to secure our futures. That is the easy way." "And the ugly way?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Jason scoffed loudly from the doorway. "The ugly way is we drag you into a courtroom. Old man, we have already drafted the petition. We will tell a judge about your little collapse in the garden. We will testify that your memory is failing, that you are becoming erratic and hostile, and that you are utterly incapable of managing a $5 million estate. We will have you declared medically and legally incompetent." Sarah stepped right up to the desk, leaning down so her face was level with mine. The sheer venom in her expression was breathtaking. "Do you understand what that means? We will seize total guardianship. We will freeze your personal accounts, sell this ridiculous house, and stick you in a managed care facility where you belong. We will take every single penny by force, and you will spend the rest of your pathetic life eating pureed food and staring at a wall." The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of her words hung in the air, a toxic cloud that threatened to choke me. These were the children Eleanor had rocked to sleep. These were the children I had sacrificed my youth, my health, and my peace of mind to provide for. I looked at the three of them, really looked at them. And I realized I did not recognize a single feature. They were absolute strangers wearing the faces of my family. "You would drag your own father through a humiliating public trial," I said slowly, testing the absolute limits of their depravity. "You would strip away my dignity, my freedom, and my home, all for money that you did not earn." "Earn?" Richard laughed, a harsh, barking sound that held absolutely zero warmth. "Do not give us that tired, pull yourself up by your bootstraps garbage. You spent 40 years hiding in a dirty machine shop, hoarding wealth while we had to scrape by in the real world. You owe us this. That money is nothing but our rightful piggy bank, and you are just a stubborn, outdated obstacle keeping us from it. You are 68 years old. Your time is over. Step aside and let us take what is ours." In that precise moment, a profound, irreversible shift occurred deep within my chest. The last, fragile thread of paternal obligation I held on to cleanly snapped. The blind spot that had protected them from my judgment for decades vanished entirely. I did not see my sons and my daughter anymore. I saw 3 dangerous, parasitic adversaries who were actively plotting my total destruction to save themselves from the disastrous debts the private investigator had uncovered. They wanted war. They wanted to destroy me. But to win a war against an enemy who thinks they have you cornered, you must first convince them that their trap has worked perfectly. I let my shoulders slump. I allowed a heavy, defeated sigh to escape my lips, intentionally making my breathing sound a little ragged, a little older. I let my hands tremble just slightly as I reached out and touched the edge of the thick legal folder. I had to sell the performance of a lifetime. "You leave me absolutely no choice," I mumbled, staring down at the polished wood of my desk. I kept my voice hollow, drained of all fight and resistance. "If I fight you in court, the legal fees alone would bleed the estate dry, and the stress would probably kill me." "Exactly," Richard said, a sickening, triumphant smirk spreading across his face. He instantly relaxed, his aggressive posture melting into pure, arrogant victory. "It is simple math. Dad, you cannot win this. So just sign the damn papers." Sarah let out a long, dramatic breath of relief, already calculating how fast she could wire the funds to stop the foreclosure on her mansion. Jason finally pushed himself off the doorframe, a greedy, hungry light igniting in his eyes as he envisioned paying off his dangerous shadow lenders. I picked up a heavy brass pen from my desk organizer, letting it hover over the signature line for a long, agonizing moment. Then, I slowly set it down. "I will sign it," I said, my voice barely audible. "I will dissolve the trust and give you the $5 million. But I cannot do it today." "Why the hell not?" Jason snapped, the panic instantly flaring back to life. "Because transferring a sum that large from a heavily structured revocable trust requires my primary corporate accountant to untangle a massive web of tax liabilities." I lied smoothly, weaving a perfectly reasonable corporate excuse they were too desperate to question. "If I just sign this document today without filing the proper capital gains disclosures, the federal government will freeze the entire $5 million pending an audit. It could take years to unlock." "Nobody gets a dime." Richard's jaw tightened. He knew enough about high-level finance to know I was telling a plausible truth. The absolute last thing any of them wanted was the federal tax authorities freezing their salvation. "How long?" Richard demanded, tapping his expensive leather shoe impatiently against the floorboards. "1 week," I said, looking up at him with the tired, defeated eyes of a broken man. "Give me exactly 1 week to sit down with my accountant, clear the tax hurdles, and liquidate the trust properly. Next Sunday, we will meet, and I will hand you the cashier's checks." "You have my word." Sarah looked at Richard, silently urging him to accept the deal. A week was excruciating, but it was better than years of legal battles or frozen assets. Richard stared at me for a long time, searching my face for any sign of deception. But all he saw was a tired, sad old man surrendering his kingdom. 1 week, Richard finally agreed, his voice dripping with condescension. "Next Sunday, we get our money. But if you try to pull a fast one, Dad, I swear to God I will file the incompetency papers Monday morning, and I will make sure the judge locks you away in the worst facility in the state. There will be no tricks, I promised softly. They turned and walked out of my study, not bothering to say goodbye. The front door slammed shut, shaking the picture frames on the wall. I listened as their expensive cars roared to life and sped down the gravel driveway, leaving me in the heavy silence of my home once again. I sat perfectly still for several minutes, making absolutely sure they were gone. Then, I slowly sat up straight. The trembling in my hands vanished instantly. The defeated slump of my shoulders disappeared. I lowered my eyes to hide the sharp, predatory gleam I knew was dancing in them, securing the exact amount of time I needed to orchestrate their absolute ruin. They thought they had backed me into a corner, but all they had done was hand me the matches to burn their entire lives to ashes. A ticking clock is only terrifying if you are the one tied to the bomb, and my children had no idea I was the one holding the wire cutters. The 7 days I had bought myself stretched out before me like a vast, blank canvas, and I intended to paint a masterpiece of absolute financial destruction. I did not waste a single second of my Monday morning. While Richard was likely sitting in his failing commercial real estate office, arrogantly dreaming of his impending bailout, I was sitting across a massive oak desk from the most dangerous man I knew. His name was Thomas Sterling. He was not a flashy, slick-haired estate lawyer like the parasite my children had brought to my hospital bed. Thomas was a 70-year-old corporate attack dog. We had spent decades together in the trenches of the manufacturing industry, crushing union disputes, hostile takeovers, and predatory vendors. He wore suspenders, drank his coffee black, and possessed a legal mind as sharp and unforgiving as a guillotine blade. I laid the private investigator's massive folder on his desk alongside the original charter for the revocable trust. I explained everything. I told him about the hospital ambush, the staggering debts my children had accumulated, and the horrifying shadow loans they had secured using my impending death as collateral. Thomas did not gasp. He did not offer empty sympathy. He simply adjusted his reading glasses, opened the trust document, and began to read with the terrifying focus of a predator hunting for a weak point in a fence. Richard thought his Monday morning incompetency petition was a trump card, completely blind to the fact that by Friday, there would be absolutely nothing left for a judge to freeze. "Arthur," Thomas finally said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that commanded total silence in a room. "The beauty of a revocable trust is entirely contained within the name itself. It is revocable. As the sole grantor and current trustee, you possess the absolute unilateral right to amend, alter, or entirely dissolve this entity at any given moment. You do not need their permission. You do not even need to notify them until the funds are completely reallocated." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool glass of his desk, the anger burning hot and bright in my chest. "I want it gone. Thomas. Every single penny. I want to liquidate the entire $5 million and move it somewhere they can never, ever reach it. I want to build an absolute fortress around that money by the end of the week." Thomas smiled, a thin, ruthless stretching of his lips that would have made my children violently ill if they could see it. We spent the next 6 hours drafting the dissolution paperwork. We systematically dismantled the $5 million safety net I had spent my entire life building, brick by legal brick. But the money had to go somewhere. I refused to let it sit in a vulnerable personal checking account where a corrupt judge, swayed by Richard's impending incompetency lawsuit, could potentially freeze it. Furthermore, I wanted a legacy that Eleanor would actually be proud of, a legacy untainted by the overwhelming greed our children had cultivated. Under Thomas's meticulous guidance, we established a brand new, ironclad, irrevocable charitable foundation. The charter was completely bulletproof, dedicating the entire $5 million to 2 very specific causes: comprehensive vocational training programs for underprivileged youth and permanent housing assistance for disabled military veterans. I named it the Eleanor Foundation. Once the funds crossed the wire into that specific tax-exempt entity, They were legally untouchable. Neither I nor my children could ever pull them back. The money belonged to the world now, destined to help people who actually understood the value of hard work and sacrifice. But my retribution could not stop there. Liquidating the trust was only the first half of the equation. To truly spring the trap, I had to ensure my children were left completely naked and exposed to the financial wolves they had invited into their lives. The shadow lenders were circling Jason, and Sarah's bank was preparing the final foreclosure. But the legal maneuver I was about to execute would ensure their collisions with reality were completely unsurvivable. I ordered Thomas to conduct a rapid, exhaustive audit of my personal credit file and banking history. I needed to be absolutely certain that my name was not tangentially attached to any of their toxic liabilities. Decades ago, I had co-signed a modest student loan for Sarah, and I once acted as a personal guarantor on Richard's very first apartment lease. We hunted down those ancient, dormant financial tethers and aggressively severed them. Thomas sent formal legal notices to the respective institutions that my financial backing was permanently revoked. I instructed my bank to place a hard fraud alert on my Social Security number, blocking any new lines of credit from being opened. This effectively slammed the door on any desperate, last-minute identity theft my children might attempt when their backs were truly against the wall. Then, Thomas executed the most brilliant, devastating stroke of the entire afternoon. The private investigator had provided us with the exact names and corporate addresses of the predatory lenders and hard money loan sharks who held my children's massive promissory notes. Thomas drafted highly formal, certified letters to each of these institutions. The letters did not mention my children's debts directly, as that would violate financial privacy laws. Instead, they simply served as a blanket legal notification from the estate of Arthur, officially stating that the $5 million revocable trust, which had previously been listed as potential future collateral by external parties, was now permanently dissolved and held a total balance of exactly $0. I pictured the moment those certified letters would land on the heavy mahogany desks of those ruthless creditors. The realization would be instantaneous and catastrophic for my children. The massive, golden safety net the lenders were relying on to secure their high-interest loans had simply vanished into thin air. Without the trust to guarantee repayment, Richard, Sarah, and Jason would instantly transition from valuable, high-yield clients into massive, toxic liabilities. The lenders would have absolutely no choice but to immediately call in the loans, demanding payment in full before my children could scramble to declare bankruptcy. The trap was flawless. By late Wednesday afternoon, the operation was complete. The $5 million had officially cleared the final wire transfer, settling safely into the heavily fortified accounts of the Eleanor Foundation. The certified letters were currently sitting in the back of postal trucks, speeding toward their devastating destinations across the city. I sat in Thomas's office, staring at the final confirmation receipt in my hands. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried since that horrible hospital ambush completely lifted from my shoulders. I was technically poorer than I had been in 40 years, living solely on my modest retirement reserve, but I felt like the wealthiest man on the face of the earth. I had protected my wife's memory. I had secured a future for people who truly needed it, and I had severed the parasitic leeches that had attached themselves to my life's work. I thanked Thomas, shook his firm hand, and walked out of his office into the crisp autumn air. The trap was fully set, the mechanisms were locked into place, and the blast radius was precisely calculated. All that remained was to convince my children to step directly onto the landmine. It was time to give them exactly what they wanted. It was time to play the defeated fool. The most dangerous lie you can tell a greedy person is exactly what they want to hear. I was about to feed my children a perfectly poisoned apple, coated entirely in the sweet sugar of my own perceived surrender. As I picked up the heavy telephone receiver in my quiet, sunlit study, I wondered exactly how many hours it would take for Thomas Sterling's certified letters to reach their shadow lenders and trigger the financial avalanche they could no longer escape. I dialed Richard's direct office line. He answered on the second ring, his tone brisk, sharp, and entirely devoid of warmth. He barked his own name into the receiver, sounding exactly like a man who was desperately trying to project an aura of control while his empire crumbled around him. I closed my eyes and completely relaxed my posture, letting my shoulders slump forward. I needed to physically embody the lie. When I spoke, I deliberately softened my voice, stripping away all the authority and iron I had commanded for 40 years in the manufacturing business. I added a slight, breathless rasp, the sound of an elderly man who had simply run out of fight. "Richard," I said softly. "It is Dad." There was a brief pause on the line. The aggressive corporate persona vanished, replaced instantly by the calculating caution of a predator sensing weakness. "Dad, I am incredibly busy right now." "I hope you're calling with an update on the accountant." "I am," I replied, letting out a long, manufactured sigh of sheer exhaustion. "You were right, Richard. You were all right. My mind is just not what it used to be. The garden incident really took it out of me. I'm tired of fighting. I spoke with my people, and the tax liabilities have been entirely cleared. The revocable trust is officially dissolved. The $5 million is liquid and ready to be dispersed." I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. It was the sound of a drowning man finally breaking the surface of the water. "Hold on," Richard commanded, his voice trembling with barely suppressed euphoria. "I am merging Sarah and Jason into this call. Do not say another word until they are on the line." The phone clicked, followed by a brief series of electronic chimes. My children were using modern technology to bridge their collective greed. Within 30 seconds, Sarah's shrill voice and Jason's arrogant drawl filled my ear. "What is going on?" Sarah demanded instantly. "Is it done?" "Dad has an announcement," Richard said smoothly, stepping naturally into the role of the victorious general presenting the spoils of war to his lieutenants. "Go ahead, Dad. Tell them what you just told me." I repeated my performance, dialing up the pathetic, defeated undertones. I apologized for being stubborn. I told them that a man of my age had no business hoarding such a massive amount of wealth, while his brilliant, successful children needed capital to thrive. I fed them every single hollow validation they had ever craved, and they swallowed it whole without a single moment of hesitation or suspicion. The reaction was instantaneous, and it was absolutely sickening. They did not ask how I was feeling. They did not express relief that we had avoided a brutal court battle. The very second they believed the $5 million was unsecured and available, the flimsy veneer of family unity completely shattered, and they turned on each other like starving wolves over a fresh carcass. "Excellent," Richard said, his voice dripping with authority. "Since I coordinated the legal strategy and essentially managed the dissolution, I will be taking a slight administrative premium off the top. Say $200,000. The remainder will be split 3 ways. "Absolutely not," Sarah shrieked, her voice echoing painfully through the telephone speaker. "Are you out of your mind, Richard?" "We agreed on equal thirds. I need my full $1.6 million immediately. You have absolutely no idea what kind of liquidity crisis I am managing right now. The bank is literally breathing down my neck." "Your mortgage problems are your own fault, Sarah," Jason sneered, his tone arrogant and dismissing. "And Richard, you are not taking a management fee for hiring a cheap lawyer. I need my share wired directly into a specific offshore holding account by Friday morning. I have private equity investors who do not care about traditional banking hours, and they are demanding their returns." I sat perfectly still in my leather armchair, holding the receiver away from my ear as they viciously tore into one another. They were screaming over percentages, demanding wire transfers, and hurling vicious insults regarding each other's financial failures. They were viciously dividing a kingdom of ash, entirely blind to the fact that their frantic arguments were providing me with the absolute confirmation I needed that their destruction was imminent. Their desperate, panicked slips about banks and private equity investors proved that Thomas Sterling's certified letters were about to land like atomic bombs in their lives. I let them argue for a full 5 minutes, allowing their greed to completely blind them to any potential trap. Then, I brought the phone back to my mouth and spoke, injecting a trembling, grandfatherly sadness into my words. "Please," I pleaded softly. "Please do not fight. There is plenty of money for everyone. I do not want our family to be torn apart by this." The line instantly went quiet. They were momentarily shamed, not by their own behavior, but by the realization that they still needed me to physically hand over the funds. "We are not fighting, Dad," Richard lied smoothly, his tone returning to a condescending purr. "We are simply discussing logistics. How are we executing the transfer?" "I want to do this properly," I said, my voice steadying just slightly. "I want us to sit down together, as a family, one last time before I step back and let you take the reins. I want to celebrate this new chapter." "Celebrate?" Sarah asked, a hint of suspicion finally creeping into her voice. "Dad, we just need the checks." "And you will get them," I assured her warmly. "But we are going to do it at Laura." A stunned silence fell over the conference call. Laura was not just a restaurant. It was the absolute pinnacle of culinary excess in our city. It was an opulent, fiercely exclusive dining establishment situated on the top floor of a downtown skyscraper, boasting panoramic views and a waiting list that stretched for 6 months. It was the exact kind of high-status, obscenely expensive environment my children desperately craved but could never truly afford without drowning in further credit card debt. "Laura?" Jason echoed, sounding genuinely impressed for the first time in his adult life. "You got a table there?" "I did better than a table," I replied, leaning back in my chair and staring up at the ornate plaster ceiling of my study. "I paid a substantial premium to secure the Sovereign Room. It is their private dining suite. I have booked it for this coming Friday evening at 8 o'clock. We will have complete privacy. We will eat the best food in the city, open a bottle of vintage champagne, and at the end of the evening, I will personally hand each of you a certified cashier's check for your exact, equal portion of the trust." I could practically hear the greedy gears turning in their heads. A free, lavish meal at the city's most exclusive restaurant, culminating in a multi-million-dollar payday. It was the ultimate validation of their toxic lifestyles. It was an offer they were biologically incapable of refusing. "Friday at 8 o'clock, Richard confirmed, his voice thick with profound satisfaction. "We will be there, Dad. And listen, I know things got a little heated at the hospital, but this is the right move. You are doing the right thing for your legacy." "I know I am. Richard," I said, allowing a tiny, genuine sliver of ice to slip into my tone. "I will see you all on Friday." I placed the receiver back onto the cradle, severing the connection. The heavy silence of the house rushed back in, but it no longer felt suffocating. It felt like the deep, breathless quiet right before a massive thunderstorm breaks open the sky. I stood up from my leather armchair, rolling my shoulders back. The manufactured tremble in my hands vanished completely. The feigned exhaustion evaporated from my bones. I walked over to the large bay window overlooking the very rose garden where I had collapsed just over a week ago. I was not a tired, defeated old man. I was the architect of their absolute ruin, and they had just gleefully accepted the invitation to their own execution. I spent the next 2 days finalizing the operational details of the dinner. I visited my personal bank and withdrew a significant amount of cash from my retirement savings to cover the exorbitant upfront cost of the Sovereign Room at Laura. I considered it the price of admission to the greatest, most satisfying theatrical performance of my entire life. I also visited a high-end stationery store, purchasing 3 thick, heavy manila envelopes and 3 beautiful, gold-embossed presentation folders. Inside those folders, I did not place cashier's checks. I placed the meticulously printed, legally binding tax receipts from the Eleanor Foundation, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the $5 million was irrevocably gone forever, donated entirely to charity. And right behind those receipts, I placed crisp copies of the certified letters Thomas Sterling had mailed to their respective creditors, the letters that legally stripped away their financial armor and exposed them to the wolves. Friday evening arrived with a cool, crisp autumn breeze. I dressed in my finest, charcoal gray tailored suit, the one I used to wear when closing massive manufacturing deals. I tied a perfect Windsor knot, polished my shoes until they gleamed like dark mirrors, and slipped the 3 heavy manila envelopes into the inner breast pocket of my jacket. I looked at myself in the hallway mirror one last time before stepping out the front door. The man staring back at me was not a victim. He was a father who had finally woken up, completely prepared to deliver the most devastating lesson his children would ever learn. I locked the heavy oak door behind me, stepped into the waiting town car I had hired for the evening, and instructed the driver to take me downtown. It was time to serve the final course. The elevator ride to the top floor of the restaurant felt like an ascension to a glittering sacrificial altar, though my children remained blissfully ignorant of who was actually on the chopping block tonight. The heavy manila envelopes resting inside my tailored breast jacket seemed to pulse against my ribs with a radioactive energy, waiting for the precise moment to detonate their perfectly curated lives. When the polished brass doors slid open, the maitre d' escorted me past the crowded main dining area and into the sovereign room. It was a masterpiece of modern opulence. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the city skyline, a sprawling grid of neon and streetlights that looked like a carpet of crushed diamonds. A massive mahogany table sat in the center of the room, adorned with imported orchids and glowing crystal centerpieces. I took my seat at the head of the table and waited. They arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, sweeping into the private dining room with the hurricane-force arrogance of royalty returning to their castle. Richard wore a brand-new navy blue bespoke suit that undoubtedly cost more than a reliable used car, a sartorial lie purchased on credit he did not possess. Sarah was draped in a dark silk evening gown, her neck heavy with diamond jewelry she had likely leveraged her very soul to acquire. Jason trailed behind them, dressed in a trendy, avant-garde designer outfit that screamed new money, financed entirely by the dangerous men who were currently hunting him. They did not greet me with hugs. They did not ask how I was feeling or if the ride downtown was comfortable. They simply took their seats and immediately summoned the private sommelier, Richard, without even glancing in my direction to consult my preferences, ordered 2 bottles of the establishment's most expensive vintage champagne, a label that ran over $3,000 a bottle. I smiled gently as the sommelier poured the bubbling gold liquid into our crystal flutes, silently counting down the minutes until their delicate glass kingdom shattered into 1,000,000 jagged pieces. The dinner service began, an endless parade of decadent, heavily buttered delicacies. We ate seared foie gras, butter-poached lobster, and thick cuts of Wagyu beef that melted on the tongue. But the real spectacle was the conversation. For 2 entire hours, I sat in silence and listened to my children recklessly spend the $5 million they believed was sitting in my pocket. Richard boasted loudly about a massive commercial complex he was planning to acquire on Monday morning, loudly declaring to the empty room that his firm was about to dominate the downtown real estate market. Sarah chimed in, excitedly describing the extensive, wildly expensive renovations she had already commissioned for her sprawling mansion, detailing the imported Italian marble she had selected for her new outdoor kitchen. Jason laughed, swirling his champagne, bragging about how his private equity investors were begging him to let them double their stake in his phantom technology company. They were drunk on their own hubris, intoxicated by the sheer relief of their impending salvation. They treated me not as a father, but as a silent, benevolent banker who had finally learned his place. They ignored the waiters, barked orders at the sommelier, and completely dominated the airspace with their aggressive, manufactured success. I watched them gorge themselves on expensive food, knowing exactly what kind of bitter, inescapable poison awaited them at the end of the meal. Finally, the dessert plates were cleared away by a team of silent, white-gloved staff. The heavy oak doors of the sovereign room clicked shut, leaving the 4 of us entirely alone in the glittering glass box overlooking the city. Richard leaned back in his plush leather chair, unbuttoning his tailored suit jacket. He checked his heavy gold watch, a predatory gleam flashing in his eyes. "Well, Dad," Richard said, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. "The food was spectacular. The champagne was excellent. But I think we have indulged in enough pleasantries for one evening. We all have incredibly busy weekends ahead of us, and Monday morning comes fast. It is time to finalize our arrangement." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes wide and hungry, completely abandoning her polished socialite persona. "Yes, Dad, the checks. Let us get this over with so we can all move forward." Jason simply drummed his fingers aggressively against the mahogany table, silently demanding his payout. I looked at the three of them. I looked at the greedy, grasping faces of the children I had spent 40 years of my life trying to protect. I felt a fleeting, microscopic ghost of sorrow pass through my chest, mourning the family we could have been, before my iron resolve completely crushed it. "Of course," I said softly, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "It is time to settle the accounts." I reached into the inner breast pocket of my charcoal jacket. I withdrew the 3 thick, heavy manila envelopes. The room went entirely silent. I could practically hear their hearts hammering with raw, unadulterated greed. I slid the first envelope down the polished wood toward Richard. I slid the second toward Sarah. I handed the third directly to Jason. "Your inheritance," I announced, my voice echoing with a terrifying finality. "Exactly as you deserve." They did not hesitate. They tore into the manila envelopes like starving scavengers ripping into a fresh kill. Richard pulled out his beautiful, gold-embossed presentation folder first. He flipped it open, expecting to see a crisp, multi-million-dollar cashier's check bearing his name. Instead, his eyes landed on the bold, black letterhead of the Eleanor Foundation. I watched the exact moment the realization hit him. The smug, arrogant color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty snow. His eyes darted frantically across the legal paragraphs, reading the undeniable, legally binding language that confirmed the entire $5 million revocable trust had been irrevocably liquidated and transferred to a charitable organization. "What is this?" Richard whispered, his voice cracking, sounding like a terrified child. "Dad, what the hell is this? This is a tax receipt. Where is the bank draft?" Sarah ripped her folder open next. She stared at the identical charitable transfer documents, her heavily manicured hands beginning to shake violently. "Charity? You gave it to a charity? A foundation? Dad, stop playing games." "Where is our money?" Jason threw his documents onto the table, his face twisting into a mask of pure, panic-stricken rage. "This is a joke. This is some kind of sick, twisted joke to teach us a lesson. Tell me you have the real checks in your pocket, old man, or I swear to God." "Keep reading," I commanded, my voice slicing through their rising panic like a steel blade. All the manufactured weakness, all the feigned exhaustion I had projected over the past week, vanished entirely. I sat up straight, squaring my shoulders, projecting the full, terrifying authority of a man who had just checkmated his enemies. "Look at the second page. Look at the copies of the certified letters my attorney mailed out on Wednesday afternoon." Richard's trembling fingers flipped to the next page. He stared at the copy of the formal legal notification addressed directly to his most aggressive commercial lender. Sarah found the letter addressed to her primary mortgage holder. Jason pulled out a stack of 3 separate letters, all addressed to the dangerous, unregulated shadow lenders who held his massive promissory notes. The letters explicitly stated that the $5 million trust, which they had all fraudulently listed as impending collateral, no longer existed. "You took out shadow loans against my death," I said, my voice dangerously calm, ringing loud and clear in the opulent dining room. "You leveraged my life's work to fund your pathetic, hollow lifestyles. You brought a corporate attack dog to my hospital bed, and you threatened to drag my name through a courtroom and lock me in a cage just to save yourselves from your own profound stupidity." "No!" Sarah gasped, clutching her chest, her diamond necklace suddenly looking like a heavy, suffocating chain. No, the bank. The bank is going to foreclose on Monday. I needed that wire transfer tomorrow morning. Dad, you cannot do this. They will take my house. They will take everything, Richard breathed, staring blankly at the glass window, the reflection of the city lights offering no comfort. My firm, my cars, my accounts. The lenders will see this notification and instantly call in the margins. I am completely underwater. I am ruined. Jason sprang up from his chair, knocking his crystal champagne flute over. The $3,000 liquid spilled across the polished mahogany, dripping onto the floor like golden blood. He slammed his fists onto the table, his eyes wide with genuine, life-threatening terror. "Do you have any idea who I borrowed money from?" Jason screamed, his voice breaking into a hysterical pitch. "They are not banks. Dad, they are animals. When they find out there is no trust, they are going to come looking for me. They are going to break my legs. You have to reverse this. You have to pull the money back right now." "It is an irrevocable charitable foundation, Jason," I stated coldly, looking him dead in the eye. "The money is gone. It belongs to underprivileged kids and disabled veterans now, people who actually know how to survive a hard day of work. Not a single penny can ever be retrieved. And furthermore, I have legally severed myself as a guarantor from any of your past accounts. My credit is locked. My assets are untouchable. You are completely on your own." The sheer, crushing weight of their new reality slammed down upon them all at once. The illusion of their wealth was completely shattered, and the terrifying, unavoidable consequences of their greed were staring them directly in the face. They were sitting in the most expensive dining room in the city, wearing clothes they could not afford, drinking champagne they could not pay for, realizing they were absolutely, undeniably broke. The explosion of their collective rage was a symphony of raw panic, a chaotic, deafening noise that finally signaled the absolute end of their unearned empire. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair at the head of the mahogany table, watching the reality of their complete destruction tear through the glittering private dining room. Richard was the first to find his voice, though it was completely stripped of its usual corporate arrogance. He stood up so fast his heavy chair crashed backward onto the plush carpet. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "I will sue you!" Richard screamed, his face flushing a dangerous, dark crimson. "I will drag you into federal court. I will hire the most vicious litigators in the state and prove that you were mentally compromised when you signed these transfer documents. I will have that charitable foundation dismantled piece by piece." I picked up my linen napkin and calmly wiped my mouth, completely unfazed by his pathetic tantrum. "You cannot sue an irrevocable charity dedicated to disabled veterans. Richard, no judge in this country would entertain such a transparently greedy, malicious lawsuit. And even if you tried, you do not have the money to hire a parking ticket lawyer, let alone a federal litigation team. Your commercial firm is functionally bankrupt. Your accounts are frozen. You have absolutely nothing left to fight with." Sarah collapsed back into her seat, burying her face in her hands. Her diamond jewelry clinking against the table sounded like the rattling of chains. She began to sob uncontrollably, the heavy theatrical makeup she wore smearing down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. "Dad, please," Sarah begged, her voice thick with absolute desperation. She reached across the table, trying to grab my sleeve, but I pulled my arm away. "Please, you sold the manufacturing business for $8 million. I know you did. Even if the trust is gone, you still have $3 million sitting in your personal accounts. Give me my share of that. Just give me enough to pay the mortgage arrears so the bank does not take my home. That remaining $3 million is locked into an irrevocable, heavily shielded annuity designed solely to cover my personal living expenses and potential medical care for the rest of my natural life," I explained coldly, watching the last sliver of hope die in her eyes. "You and your brothers made it abundantly clear in that hospital room that you had absolutely no intention of caring for me in my old age. You wanted to throw me into a substandard state facility and steal my safety net. So, I built a new safety net. One that you can never, ever touch." Jason did not yell, and he did not cry. He was pacing back and forth in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows like a trapped, terrified animal. while Richard and Sarah frantically scrambled to save their drowning ships. They had no idea I was already packing my bags for a destination they would never find, effectively removing myself as their final emotional punching bag. Jason ran his hands through his hair, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked at the copies of the certified letters on the table, the letters that had permanently exposed him to the dangerous, unregulated private lenders he owed massive sums of money to. "I am a dead man," Jason muttered, his eyes wide and vacant. He suddenly stopped pacing and rushed toward me, his hands outstretched. "Dad, give me your wallet." "Give me your credit cards, your cash, whatever you have on you right now. I need to get out of the city tonight. They are going to come looking for me. You have to help me." I looked at my youngest son, a man who had spent his entire adult life entirely convinced that the world owed him a living, and I felt absolutely nothing. The paternal bond had been thoroughly, surgically removed. I reached into my tailored jacket and withdrew a thick silver money clip. I peeled off enough crisp $100 bills to cover the exorbitant cost of our lavish dinner, the $3,000 vintage champagne they had ordered, and a massive 50% tip for the restaurant staff my children had treated so poorly all evening. I placed the stack of cash firmly in the center of the table, well out of Jason's desperate reach. "Dinner is paid for," I announced, my voice carrying a quiet, unshakable authority. I stood up and buttoned my charcoal suit jacket. "Consider it my final, parting contribution to your extravagant, fraudulent lifestyles. You wanted your inheritance early. You wanted independence from my rules. Congratulations. You are now entirely self-made." I turned my back on them and walked toward the exit. "Dad, get back here!" Richard roared, his voice cracking with pure terror. "You cannot do this to us!" I did not stop. I did not look back. I opened the heavy oak doors of the sovereign room, stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway, and let the doors click firmly shut behind me, instantly silencing their frantic, overlapping screams. I walked to the elevator, pressed the lobby button, and rode down to the street in absolute, glorious peace. The fallout over the next several weeks was swift, brutal, and entirely deserved. I immediately put my sprawling suburban estate on the market, without the heavy burden of my children's constant demands. The massive house simply felt unnecessary. It sold in 5 days for 20% over the asking price. I packed a single suitcase of clothes, boxed up my favorite antique woodworking tools, and quietly relocated. During that time, my cell phone became a relentless, vibrating beacon of their suffering. My voicemail inbox filled to absolute capacity daily. Thomas Sterling, my ruthless corporate attorney, provided me with clinical, highly satisfying updates on their collapse. Richard's commercial real estate firm imploded exactly 48 hours after his lenders received the certified letters. The banks aggressively called in his margins, completely freezing his business accounts. He was forced to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy by the end of the week. His leased luxury cars were quietly repossessed from his office parking lot in the dead of night, leaving him to take the public bus back to a rented apartment he could no longer afford. Sarah's situation was equally disastrous. Her primary mortgage lender rejected her frantic pleas for an extension. The bank formally seized the mansion, changing the locks and forcing her and her husband out onto the street. The profound social humiliation she had spent her entire life running from finally caught up with her. She was banished from her exclusive country club. Her wealthy friends completely blocked her phone number, and she was forced to move into a cramped, noisy apartment complex on the industrial side of the city. And Jason simply vanished. Thomas Sterling informed me that Jason had abandoned his expensive downtown loft, leaving all of his designer clothes and furniture behind. He fled the state entirely, desperately trying to disappear off the grid to escape the relentless collection agencies and the furious private equity investors he had blatantly defrauded. He was a ghost, running from a shadow he could never outpace. Whenever my phone screen lit up with a blocked caller ID or a frantic, pleading text message from one of my children, I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I simply pressed the delete button, erasing their panic from my life without listening to a single second of their excuses. They made their choices in that sterile hospital room. They dug their own massive financial graves with their overwhelming greed, and I merely handed them the shovels. I now live in a modest, weather-beaten cottage in a quiet coastal town in Maine. I spend my mornings drinking dark coffee on the wooden porch, watching the Atlantic Ocean crash violently against the rocky shoreline. The cold, salty air fills my lungs, entirely washing away 40 years of industrial manufacturing dust and the toxic, suffocating stress of my ungrateful family. I spend my afternoons volunteering at the local community center. I teach basic carpentry and metalworking skills to young men and women from the surrounding rural counties. These kids actually want to learn. They want to work with their hands and build a tangible, honest life for themselves. They look at me with genuine, earned respect. They do not see a walking bank account or a foolish old man waiting to die. They see a mentor. Every quarter, I receive a thick envelope from the Eleanor Foundation. The reports are beautiful. They detail the exact number of homeless veterans who have been moved into permanent, safe housing, and the number of underprivileged youths who have received full scholarships for vocational training. My late wife's name is now permanently attached to a legacy of genuine, hard-working compassion. It is a legacy of building broken people up, rather than enabling the parasitic, destructive impulses of the privileged. I am 68 years old, and for the very first time in my adult life, I am completely and utterly free. I sleep deeply through the night, perfectly content in the absolute knowledge that true justice is not merely a philosophical concept. It is a real, tangible force. And sometimes, it is a dish best served on a silver platter, inside the most expensive dining room in the city, right before you walk out the door and leave the monsters with the bill. Thank you so much for watching my story. If you enjoyed this journey of taking back control and serving absolute justice to entitled relatives, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share this with anyone who needs a strong reminder that respect must be earned, never demanded. I want to hear from you in the comments section below, so please drop the word karma so I know you stayed with me until the very end. And do not forget to hit that hype button so this video can reach more viewers who appreciate a truly satisfying payoff.